Some of the deepest wounds aren't inflicted by a strike, a cut, or a blow. They're inflicted by someone who leaves the room, or someone who never leaves it, but is still never there. I'm Stephen Rohde. This is Course Correction. Some of you have been carrying a pattern since our last episode. It was the one that you named for yourself before we started talking about the architecture and the reflex and the bell that never stopped ringing. Hold on to it a little longer today, because what we're about to talk about is where that bell came from. Last time we named the mechanism, or the system. It was the reflex that fires before the choice is even available to you. Today we go one layer deeper, not to how it runs, but to what built it. You already know the bell is still ringing. That part isn't new information anymore. What's new today is the environment that built it, the specific conditions that wired it in before you had any say in the matter. So let's go there. You may remember the man I introduced to you in episode 4. He was the father in the grocery store checkout line when his 5-year-old daughter kept hitting his leg, asking for Sour Patch Kids candy. Do you remember how he caught himself before yelling at her in rage? Remember, he paused, he recognized what was happening, he considered what was actually in front of him, and then he adjusted his response and chose to hug her instead of exploding. He left his daughter with his wife, walked out to the parking lot, and broke down into tears, but couldn't explain why. He asked me a question that day that I couldn't fully answer yet. He asked, why did I feel that much rage over Katie just wanting some candy? And why did that leave me in tears? Through our discussions, here's what we found. This man's mother died when he was 3 years old. He was too young to remember her voice, but old enough that something in him knew she was gone and wasn't coming back. His father became lost in his grief and lost in a role he wasn't cut out for, raising a young boy by himself. As a result, he was there physically every day in the house, but emotionally, he was somewhere his young son could not reach him. He went to work, he came home, he sat in a chair. He didn't hit anyone. He didn't raise his voice. He just wasn't there. He was unavailable. So this man basically grew up alone, even with his father in the next room. He was often forced to cook his own meals or he would go hungry. His neighbor took him to the doctor when he was sick. Birthdays would pass by forgotten until a family member would call to wish him a happy birthday. When he was 9 years old, his dog died. This dog had been his closest friend. He told me that his father, still moving through that fog, carried the dog out to a dumpster in the parking lot behind the local market because it was the only thing he had the capacity to do. He didn't come back for his son. He didn't do this out of cruelty. He simply couldn't notice the boy was still standing there alone in the parking lot watching, crying, needing someone to tell him it was going to be all right. As a result of all of this, the man spent his childhood and teens doing whatever it took to be seen, to be noticed, getting in trouble in school, hanging out with the rough crowd, the kids on the fringes. By his 20s, that same hunger for attention had multiple different names. Relationships that burned hot and collapsed fast, the substances he used to numb himself, the way he'd sabotage anything good right when it started to feel safe. You see, he wasn't broken. He was still that boy in the parking lot, still trying to get someone, anyone, to reach across the space and hold him, to tell him it was going to be all right, to notice him. Now let's go back to the checkout line. His little girl reached for him, needing something from him right now, in front of everyone. That was not a 5-year-old wanting candy. That exposed the exact shape of his wound. Katie needed something from him that he did not know how to give because no one ever gave it to him. He did the work. He recognized it. He paused. He considered, and this time he chose the hug. And then he cried in the parking lot with no clue as to why. Here's why. Recognize, pause, consider, adjust, the tool that we have worked on. That is the framework this podcast has been building since episode 1, and it worked exactly the way it is supposed to for this man. But the pause does not erase what is underneath it. It only gives you a different relationship to it. Even though he changed the output, he had not yet touched the source. What traveled to him in that moment was the emotional abandonment he experienced in his father's absence. In episode 6, we called that a legacy. Then there was the rage that always flared in him without warning and before he could think, before he could choose. In episode 7, we called that an architecture. And finally, the boy, alone with the death of his dog, and the one person he needed to hold him unable to surface long enough to reach him. That is the environment that built all of this. He didn't know any of that decades later, standing in a far different parking lot. He just knew he was crying, and he didn't know why. Now you do. Most of you have spent your life using the word trauma to mean something that happened to somebody else, maybe in a car accident, or a hand raised in anger, possibly in combat. Trauma's always been something with a date attached to it, something you could point to on a calendar and say, that's when it happened. That's the loud version of trauma. It's real, and it counts. And we're going to talk about a loud version of it in a few minutes, but there's a quieter version, and it is just as real, and almost nobody recognizes it while they're living inside it. It might have been a home where everyone walked on eggshells, and where rules changed depending on someone's mood. And you learn to read that mood before you learn to read a book. It might have been a home where you learned not to expect anyone to reach for you, so you stopped asking. Or love that had to be earned through performance, good grades, good behavior, or just not being too much of a hassle. It might have been a house where your most honest self was never quite safe to bring into the room, so you adapted and built a version that was. As we consider the man from the grocery store, no one hit him. No one screamed at him. In fact, no one did anything. What happened to him doesn't show up on a police report or make the evening news. It leaves no visible marks, and that is exactly why it goes unrecognized for as long as it does. This was the only environment he knew. And here's the part that matters most. A child's nervous system doesn't experience a caregiver's absence as a preference that went unmet. It experiences it as a survival question left unanswered, because for a child, connection to a caregiver isn't just comfort, it's what keeps him alive. It's also how he learns whether he's worth loving in the first place. So when that connection is chronically missing, day after day, the nervous system reads it exactly the way it reads a physical threat. Something essential to staying alive is not there. So underneath the biology, something else is quietly being decided to, whether he matters, whether he's worth someone reaching for. The body responds accordingly, so does the sense of self, and both keep responding long after the household itself is gone. Psychiatrist and researcher Dr. Judith Herman gave what we've just described a name: complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. The distinction about this being complex PTSD isn't about severity. It's about whether the threat was a single event or something chronic. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is typically caused by one catastrophic event, say a car accident, an assault, or maybe the tragic loss of a loved one. CPTSD could be a childhood of years spent in an environment that was never quite safe to fully relax in, or an environment where the child never felt worthy of love. Think about the man we've been talking about today. He grew up in a home where love and attention were completely absent. He was alone because his father wasn't emotionally available. Therefore, his nervous system was constantly in survival mode, trying to find the basic human need of connection and love. Essentially, he experienced a consistent, low-grade threat response for years, organizing itself around that threat the only way it knew how. It built a system. It automated the reflexes. It wired the bells. That is what CPTSD describes. It is not a character flaw. It is not a weakness. It is not evidence that something went fundamentally wrong with the man himself. It was a brain executing its one directive: keep this organism safe and alive. It was operating inside conditions that required more than any child should have to manage, or even could recognize as something to manage, because it was the only world he had ever known. As a result, he was caught in a moment in a grocery store, struggling to manage his emotions, feeling shame and guilt for feeling so broken, and asking, "What is wrong with me?" This is a question I asked myself, and maybe you have too. You did not make this up. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is real. It has been documented. It has been named. It does not belong to you. I think back to my grandparents' dining room from a few episodes ago. Remember? My father and his father arguing over that punch list for the house, read out loud like a contractor's invoice. Then the 40-minute drive home after, and in silence, my brother and I in the back seat. I learned something that day without a single word being spoken. I learned how a man carries something he cannot put down, and my father had been carrying it since he was a boy. The pattern didn't start with him either. His father had his own version, and his father before that had his. One generation to the next, unseen and unchecked. This house was already built long before any of us arrived. This week, don't try to fix anything. Go back to the pattern you've been holding since last episode. I want you to find the line on the spectrum that's yours. Not the loud version, but the quiet one. Write one sentence. Not a diagnosis, just a plain, honest description. Start it with, "In my house." That's the whole assignment. You don't have to show it to anyone. You don't have to do anything with it yet. Just let it be true on the page. You now know the mechanism, and you know the environment that built it. What's left is the harder question. What did you build yourself to survive it? Every man I have sat across from in this work has built something. A way of getting through, of coping, a way of trying not to need what he wasn't given. I know I have. Next time, we look at what you built, what it's made of, and why it's gotten harder to take off than it ever was to put on. This is real, and it has been named. It doesn't belong to you. If today sounded like your house, not the loud version, but the quiet one, you don't have to keep carrying it by yourself. You can find me at yourcoretruths.com. If you know someone who needs to hear this, please send it to them too. I'm Stephen Rohde. This is Course Correction.